Today, I wanted to answer some questions that a couple of viewers had posted in the comment section of my last video, The Ties That Bind, Lasting Effects of Sexual Abuse. I wanted to take time out to do the video because I think it's important for this information to be out there. And so I did a lot of research on this, and I'll put the links to the articles that I reviewed in the description area of the video. So the first question was, what is it about sexual abuse that makes the individual so susceptible to a number of mental illnesses? And what I found is that childhood sexual abuse causes disruptions in development of a child's sense of self, leading to difficulty in relating to others, an inability to regulate reactions to stressful events, and other interpersonal and emotional challenges that make psychiatric disorders more likely. A couple of researchers and authors, Kolk and Putnam, also found that self-definition, integration, and self-regulation of affect and impulse control are jeopardized by sexual abuse, occurring during major developmental transitions from infancy to middle adulthood. For example, abuse that occurs during the preschool years may disrupt ego development and thus have a profound and pervasive negative effect on the development of the adult personality. Additionally, if an adolescent has to rely on denial and dissociation to cope with the abuse, the risk factor for severe mental illnesses are high. Others suggest that childhood sexual abuse, which is threatening by nature, may interfere in a developing child's sense of security and ability to trust others, leading to increased anxiety and emotional distress. Guilty feelings may also play a role, and survivors of child sexual abuse often report self-blame and difficulty in trusting others. So with that being said, the susceptibility to other mental illnesses such as dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorders. And what that is when a child goes through traumatic experiences, the brain protects itself and shuts off and compartmentalizes. And later in life, then what happens is an array of different personalities emerge. And they can range from an infant nonverbal to an elder that is a protector. And that's one of the more severe forms of a psychiatric disorder that would develop from childhood sexual abuse. The second question was, is sexual abuse the most powerful way to overwhelm the brain and inflict maximum damage? And I'm going to say no, that it's not, because any trauma experienced in childhood has an impact on the brain. There are various adaptive mental and physical responses to trauma, including psychological hyperarousal and dissociation. Again, well, I talked about that just a minute ago. Because the developing brain organizes and internalizes new information in a use-dependent fashion, the more the child is in a state of hyperarousal or dissociation, the more likely they are to have neuropsychiatric symptoms following the trauma. The acute adaptive states, when they persist, can become maladaptive traits. So they become negative traits that we'll use to cope in adulthood. A traumatic experience impacts the entire person. The way we think, the way we learn, the way we remember things, the way we feel about ourselves, the way we feel about other people, and the way we make sense of the world are all profoundly affected by the traumatic experience. And all of these factors are rooted in our human evolutionary experience as well as our psychobiological development. As our understanding grows about the complex nature and impact of overwhelming experiences, we recognize that trauma of sexual assault can affect every level of a person's adjustment. There's evidence about the nature and extent of psychobiological changes that are secondary to sexual assault. There's now science out there of stress-related disorders that details how stress impacts negatively on the body in a number of different ways, producing short-term and long-term physical consequences. So not only does it affect the mind, but it affects the body. And there's a great book out there by Bessel and Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. I highly suggest that it's a great read, and it really explains how the mind and body react to trauma of any kind. And the results of these studies, it shows that children's psychobiological development at an adult function can be profoundly impacted by sexual assault. Victims of this kind of trauma often suffer from a multitude of physical disorders not directly related to whatever injuries they suffered as a result of their traumatic experience. Compounding that problem is the reality of re-victimization. And this is one of the many horrors that attend upon sexual assault victims, is the experience of re-victimization. Because people who have suffered from childhood sexual abuse appear to be particularly vulnerable to re-victimization experiences. Changes are secondary to sexual assault. The results of the growing body of studies is disturbing, making it clear that children's psychobiological development and adult function can be profoundly impacted by the sexual assault. And I think I just said that just a minute ago. I'm changing pages here because there's a lot of information. In the American Journal of Psychiatry, they say, who was it that said that? There's a lot, and this will be posted in the description because there's a lot of authors on this study. Exposure to childhood sexual abuse was specifically associated with pronounced cortical thinning in the genital representation field of the primary somasensory cortex. So in the cortexes of your brain, there's a thinning. That there were studies done that shows that a thinning had taken place in the somatosensory cortex. In contrast, emotional abuse survivors, there was a cortical thinning in regions relevant to self-awareness and self-evaluation. In another article called Wounds That Heal Time, the hippocampus, which is located in the temporal lobe and involves their memory and emotion, which develops very gradually, is one of the few parts of the brain that continues to produce new cells after birth. The cells in the hippocampus have unusually large number of receptors that respond to the stress hormone cortisol. Since animal studies show that exposure to high levels of this stress hormone has toxic effect on the developing hippocampus, this brain region may be adversely affected by severe stress in childhood. So not only does it produce the stress hormone, but it has an effect on the hippocampus region of the brain. And we also know through this research that childhood abuse is linked with excess neuronal irritability. 30% of children with history of severe abuse meet the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Although they are less hyperactive than children with classic ADHD, very early childhood abuse appears to be particularly likely associated with the emergence of ADHD. Discovery that abused patients have diminished right-left hemisphere integration and smaller corpus callosum suggests an intriguing model for the emergence of one of psychiatry's least understood affliction, borderline personality. So what they're saying is that borderline personality disorder is linked with trauma in childhood. And they're doing more and more research on this. And then, let's see, the last part of it is to cope with overwhelming experiences of distress, the brain can alter patterns of signaling from the pathways involved, which can ultimately leave those regions underdeveloped from reduced input. So regions of the brain are underdeveloped because of trauma, is what this is saying. The brain of a child who's raped, for example, may react by reducing the connectivity of the regions that were hurt. So the emotional regions don't connect with the logical reasons. If abuse was of a sexual type, we saw changes in the somasensory cortex, the area that produces the input from the body to create sensations and perceptions. Somasensory areas create a map of the body on the brain, with each region processing sensation from a specific body part. And oftentimes when I talked about it in my last video, we talk about somatic body memories, and that's what that is. It's the brain linking your genital region, for example, to the traumatic experience, and there oftentimes you can experience pain. And so the last question that was posed is it possible to suffer from 95% of those symptoms you mentioned without being raped? And the answer to that is yes, because trauma has a profound effect not only on the body but on the mind. And I mentioned earlier the book The Body Keeps the Score, and that really explains how trauma affects the body and the mind. But there's also another book by Bessel and Kolk, and it's called Traumatic Stress: The Effects of Overwhelming Experience on Mind, Body, and Society. And that's another good book that really explains the connection between traumatic stress or traumatic events in childhood and how it affects us in our adult lives. So again, I hope that I've answered your questions, and I hope that I've given you some information and some insight into how trauma affects your body and your mind. I highly suggest that the two books by Bessel van Kolk that I mentioned, they're great reads. And like I said, it gives a lot more in-depth than what I can go into in this video. And thanks again to the two viewers that posted these questions. It gave me an opportunity to do some research and learn some more about trauma and how it affects the mind-body system.